Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, a Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post for Pastor Shoftim is going to focus on one pasuk and use that as a springboard to discuss this period of time that we have entered, the period of Elul, which is the period where we start to engage with the concept of change. And I say we start to engage with the concept of change. I say that deliberately because in general, by human nature, we avoid change. It's something that makes us feel uncomfortable. It makes us feel vulnerable. And a person would rather, or by the status quo of one's life is that they continue their life by habit, almost in autopilot. And they avoid this idea of change. But what Elul does is that it provides a context, an environment where change becomes more acceptable. It becomes more comfortable to look at the idea of change. But we know that to bring about change in one's life, it takes time. It's not something that can be done in a month, in an instant. It's something that really is gradual. So I think the best that we can hope for, at least at the moment in Elul, and what we can discuss in this Torah and Psychology post, is to at least come up with a clearer conceptualization of what change is, and then you can use that to start to implement during Elul and then continue throughout the rest of the year. So let's start with how to come up with a conceptualization to define what is this idea of change. And to do that, we'll look at this week's parsha. There's a pasuk that discusses the idea of appointing a king, that there will be, to appoint and choose someone to be melech of Bnei Yisrael. And the Griz discusses this and says that there's a concept, there's a idea here of choice that can be developed. The Griz has a thesis of what Bechira is, and he takes it out and extracts from this pasuk of appointing a king. And he says that up until David HaMelech was chosen to be king, anybody in Bnei Yisrael, in a sense, had the ability, could have been the king. But once David HaMelech was chosen, this idea of Bechira, once David HaMelech was chosen, it singled out David HaMelech to the exclusion of everybody else. And it created a royal line, a lineage, that once someone is born into David HaMelech's family, there's already a right in their blood, a royal blood, to be the king. So what we see here is the Bechira. Once David HaMelech was chosen, and the Griz is saying, is that it creates now a commitment, a relationship that singles out to the exclusion of everybody else and anybody else. And he develops this further and says so too with Karbonos, with Eretz Yisrael. The whole of Eretz Yisrael, it was permissible to bring Karbonos up until Yerushalayim was chosen. Once Yerushalayim, the Makam HaMikdash, was chosen, this singled out, as the Griz says, singles out that you can bring Karbonos in Yerushalayim to the exclusion of everybody, of every other place, every other location in Eretz Yisrael. And the Griz doesn't say this, but there's also an idea in Gemara and Kiddushin. Tosfos discusses what is Kiddushin. The wording of Kiddushin, the ceremony of Kiddushin, is that a man, when he says Hayat Mekadeshet Li, Kiddushin is saying that a man could marry anybody, any woman, and the whole world, any woman was permissible to him, but the Kadesh is to single out this relationship between this man and this woman to the exclusion of every other woman. So if we use this idea, we see what the Griz is developing is that Bechira has a power to it. Bechira, choice, has a power to create a commitment. It's singling out to the exclusion of everybody else or everything. So if we look at the idea of change, of Elul, we know from a psychological perspective that change and bringing about change in our life is something that requires a psychological shift. And we've discussed many times that a more adaptive and healthier way of looking at life is a movement away from a dichotomous view into a dialectical view. What that means is that sometimes there's an inclination for people to look at their life in a all or nothing way, a black and white way of thinking, that they feel that their life will be better or will have significance and value only if they have this thing, or they'll only be happy if this. It's a black and white, all or nothing, inflexible way of thinking. We want to move away to a dialectical perspective that allows a person to be more flexible A dialectical perspective allows a person to hold two, as we've discussed, two different views, even contrasting views or contradictory emotions and feelings, to hold them at the same time and to accept that they are both parts of the complexity of human nature. And this allows us to accept and in a way to function in a more adaptive way, to understand that we can have multiple ways of looking at ourselves and looking at our life. But I think what we need to do is understand the unique quality of Bechira and the unique quality of Elul, is that although a dialectical perspective is healthier, more adaptive, I think that still it's important to stress that we can convince ourselves that we are taking a dialectical perspective. We can convince ourselves that we are actually holding different options open, and that really is actually an illusion of a dialectical perspective. And actually it allows us to remain in a limbo state. It allows us to remain by sitting on the fence, to not actually take any stance and to just remain static. And this is because change, as we said, is difficult. But even if we do manage to understand conceptually, theoretically, that there's a distinction to be made and it's healthier to move away from a dichotomous view of life and to move into a dialectical perspective, we still find it difficult to take a stance and to bring about change in our life. We remain in our comfort zone of keeping all options open, keeping all doors open, keeping all options on the table. But that isn't actually that isn't using a dialectical perspective in a healthy way. It's actually still holding on to a dichotomous view and dressing it up in a dialectical perspective. It's still an illusion. And what we want to do is actually use Bechira, is to implement our free will, which is a tenet of our hashkafa in Judaism. We need to sometimes take a stance. And that means we need to deal with and juggle this complexity of a dichotomous or dialectical view, and actually try to look at the different choices that we have in our life and use our Bechira to actually say, I'm going to single out this goal, this direction, this aspect in my life or in myself that I want to work on, and make a commitment. That is what the Grizz is saying. If we actually truly use Bechira, it's singling out to the exclusion of everything else. That means that we're taking on all the baggage and the complexity that we have from our previous year, that we are holding on to still, and we're actually saying, I need to take a stance, I'm going to use the Bechira, and that is hopefully something that we can at least start to understand, and at least to start to make the cogs move and get the wheels moving in using and implementing this Bechira of taking a stance and making a commitment, singling out what we want to do in our life, how we want to move forward, to the exclusion of all the other noise and the background complexity and the baggage that we have. That is what Bechira. It's not easy, but let's just start with at least taking on the understanding and the definition of Bechira, and hopefully that will give us and make this journey a little bit easier to bring about true, authentic, healthy change in our life. Have a good Shabbos and keep well.